All right, welcome to another episode of Talkin Ball with Pat Leonard. A special guest, Gary Myers, a mentor of mine, longtime NFL columnist, best-selling author of the book Once a Giant, a story of victory, tragedy, and life after football. You can see it over my shoulder. Pick it up for Father's Day. It'd be a great Father's Day gift. It's a great book, great insight into the 1986 Super Bowl team on and off the field. He is the one and only Gary Myers. Thanks for joining us, Gary.
How you doing today, Pat?
I'm doing great. A little post-draft recap that we'll look into here. Talk Giants, talk NFL, talk Jets. Obviously, you're all over it all. You know how I'm feeling right now, a little bit of a sigh of relief, but also it was a great month of April, right? There was a lot to talk about, a lot of drama, and looking forward to get your opinion on how the Giants did and what happened across the league. So first, want to tell our listeners about Bet Online, which is your number one source for all your summer sports this season, from MLB, golf, NBA, and NHL playoff stats. All the latest stats, news, and scores available to follow your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, and odds on just about every sport out there. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Bet Online, where the game starts. And where I want to start, Gary, you know where I want to go. Giants have a draft. They have the number 6 overall pick. Drake May's name gets thrown out, J.J. McCarthy, Michael Penix Jr., and the Giants come out of it without a quarterback. What do you think of the fact that they didn't end up taking a QB here?
Well, I think the fact that Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll now doubled down on Daniel Jones when they had a chance to say, okay, we overreacted last year by giving him that contract after the Minnesota game, the playoff game. Mm-hmm. They had a chance to ease their way out of it after the guaranteed money is done following the 2024 season, and they didn't. So as far as I'm concerned, Daniel Jones is now their quarterback, even though they didn't draft him. They've had 2 opportunities now to separate themselves from Jones and didn't take advantage of that. Mm-hmm. So their jobs are now dependent on Daniel Jones, and I'm not sure that's the way they should have gone. In fact, I know that's not the way they should have gone. If I was them, the way the board broke down, no question in my mind, I would have taken J.J. McCarthy.
Why McCarthy over Penix Jr. and Bo Nix?
Well, I mean, this guy was 27-1 playing in the Big Ten. His 2 years as a starter, got to the conference, to the national playoffs both years. Didn't play well against TCU, had 2 pick sixes in that game, and they still nearly won. Then he wins the national championship in his final year at Michigan. The knock on McCarthy, I think, is so unfair. He doesn't have the volume of work that these other guys had, and that's definitely true. But he played for a coach who played an old school NFL offense and won the national championship. Right. And every time he needed McCarthy to make plays, to win games, or to separate themselves in a game, he was able to do it. Case in point, the semifinals against Alabama, Michigan trailing by 7 late in the fourth quarter. McCarthy takes them right down the field to get the tying touchdown, and they win in overtime. What else do you want the guy to do? They had a big 3rd down play against Washington in the championship game. Like, they were backed up. It was 3rd and 6 or 7 from their own 5 or 6 yard line. Washington had closed the gap a little bit. McCarthy ran for 20 yards on a busted play on 3rd down. So he showed he can make plays with his legs. I don't, just because you're throwing 40 times a game instead of 22 or 25 doesn't mean because you have more yards and touchdowns, you're a better quarterback. Sometimes it's harder to throw a 22 or 25 and be asked to make a big play when you're not really in the rhythm of a guy throwing it 40 times. I just think we got so caught up in numbers here that people were trying to downgrade McCarthy because of that. I know it's a long answer, but
no, it's great.
My feeling about Penix is I went, and I've told you this, Pat, I went to the championship game between Michigan and Washington. My son's a Michigan guy.
That must have
been awesome. I became a big Michigan fan. It was a tremendous experience. But I watched that game probably more intently than any Super Bowl I covered because I had such a rooting interest in it. And I'll admit it. I mean, I don't have to cover college football. I can have a rooting interest. I'm allowed. And so I really watched Michael Penix in that game. And Now, he played before behind that offensive line, the Joe Moore winner, the award winner, his last year at Washington. So he wasn't pressured all year. Against Texas in the semis, it was basically 7-on-7. You know, he's just sitting back there and plucking the receivers like a video game. So Michigan pressures him for the first time all season. And although they really didn't get to him until the fourth quarter, they were in his face the whole game. He kept missing Rome Odunze the whole game. And I'm going, well, this answers the question about, in my mind, about Penix. You put pressure on the guy, and he's not the same player. I've had people in the league tell me he throws the ball coming out of college as well as anybody, including Dan Marino, who a lot of people think was the best ever coming into the league throwing the ball. But when you put pressure on him, everybody becomes a different quarterback, including Tom Brady and Peyton Manning and anybody else you want to name. And I think in the NFL, the guy's going to be pressured. He can run, but he doesn't. And to me, we saw the real Michael Penix in that game. And Pat, I am shocked that in the last 10 days before the draft, he went from people considering him to be an early second-round pick to be the 8th pick in the draft. It's one thing if you start out around the combine and you're considered a second-round pick, maybe like McCarthy was, and then you work your way up by draft time. But Penix, a week or so before, nobody thought he was going in the first round. And all of a sudden you hear, you know, the Falcons take him, but you hear that the Raiders would have taken him at 13.
Yeah.
And as far as Bo Nix, I mean, what is he, about 40 years old now? Been in college about 12 years. I don't know.
Our friend Phil,
6 yards, you know.
Our friend Phil Simms feels very highly about him. And I know also, though, Phil was very particular as well on loving the fit he really ended up in. You know, feeling like he could handle the Sean Payton kind of the volume of those play calls, be the extension of the not meddling, but of the offensive coach who wants his fingerprints all over the offense. So It is sometimes about fit too, which you brought up Penix, and that's something I wanted to ask you off the bat. You know, going around the league here, this is a guy who I think, like you said, in the end, it seemed like people who scouted and watched him throw through the pre-draft, even me, it was hard not to watch him and come away thinking he was a first-round talent. But nobody saw the Atlanta Falcons taking Michael Penix Jr. at 8. And of course, they've taken a lot of criticism for this. And Kirk Cousins' agent, Mike McCarthy, came out that night and said that they were basically blindsided by it. I'm just wondering, you've covered a lot of great quarterbacks. You've covered the quarterback position specifically as closely as anybody over the last, several decades. What did you think of that team building move, of that philosophy, of that thought process behind what the Falcons did there to kind of shock the NFL?
Yeah, Pat, it's the most intriguing thing that came out of this draft. And the Falcons are not good enough to take a luxury pick like that. And I know that, I think it was Terry Fontenot, the GM, or maybe it was Raheem Morris, saying that they're kind of following the Packers' way of doing it with Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. The difference is that those quarterbacks were taken in the 20s, not in the top 10. The Packers were coming off division championship each year. One year they were coming off an NFC championship appearance. They were a good team that was saying, okay, quarterbacks fell to us, especially Rodgers, who with either Aaron Rodgers or Alex Smith that was going to be picked first in the draft. And we didn't really know that until the morning of the draft. And then Rodgers just slipped right through and I think it was to 24 maybe.
Yeah.
So that was like a bonus to the Packers picking at that spot to get a guy that we thought was going to be first in the draft. And Favre was, 34, 35, 36 at that point, right around the same age that Kirk Cousins is now. But the difference in the team makeup is, it's apples and oranges. Now you throw into it that they just signed Kirk Cousins a month ago, $90 million guaranteed in the first 2 years. My question, if I was covering the Falcons, would be, if you knew that you're going to fall in love with Michael Penix to the point that you would take him 8th in the draft, would you have signed Kirk Cousins? Because if the answer is yes, then I fire those guys because it just doesn't make any sense. Again, Penix is not 21 like McCarthy in May. He's going to be 24 before the season starts. He's had 4 major injuries, including 2 ACLs. How does that make sense to take him when you're desperate for defense? 7 players picked ahead of him were all offense. So you had the choice of whoever your number 1 rated defensive player is to help a defense that needed help. And you took a quarterback that if things go correctly, he's not going to play for at least 2 years. And that's assuming Cousins, is not going to play past another 2 years. And I think that Cousins is one of these guys, if he stays healthy, wants to play into his 40s. And if he's effective, Penix never gets on the field, except maybe like the Eagles use Jalen Hurts as a rookie, kind of as a change-up. But he's not a runner. So you're not going to put him in. It made no sense.
This was also an organization that proudly announced they were out on Lamar Jackson when he was a potential option, even if he was never actually going to come available. Right. And a team that proudly leaked that they never seriously considered Bill Belichick. So you put all those things together, and it's hard to believe in what the Falcons are doing. I agree. Let me ask you a quick question, because the Giants and the Falcons just both happen to be situations where the quarterback, who is the presumed starter and is making all the money, is coming off an injury where he might not be available for an extended time, if not the full spring and maybe even the parts of training camp, with Kirk Cousins and Daniel Jones. Does it ever work, Gary, where like right now you're going to have Drew Lock and Michael Penix Jr. on those respective teams taking a lot of, if not all, of the reps during their spring programs, getting all that chemistry going with receivers and weapons? Right. Tommy DeVito. Don't forget about him. But my question for you is, like, could it happen in the NFL in 2024 where Drew Lock and Michael Penix Jr. shows so well, let's say early in camp, they're QB1 with these guys are coming off the ACLs and Achilles. Could it happen that those guys show so well that it then becomes their job to lose because they've handled it that way? Or is it just a clear-cut case of, we've got all the money invested in this guy, and when Daniel Jones or Kirk Cousins comes back, like they're QB1, doesn't matter?
That's a really interesting question. I would think if you're going to say where would that be more likely to happen, it would be with the Giants. Because none of us think, unless Daniel Jones has an opportunity this year and he plays lights out, nobody thinks he's going to be back with the Giants in 2025.
Right.
Again, the Falcons signed Cousins knowing, obviously, that he's coming off a torn Achilles and his participation in the spring will be limited. So I don't think that Penix has a chance to overtake that. I mean, what a story that would be if that happened.
You're not kidding.
I don't anticipate that happening, but Drew Lock was in the same draft as Jones, and going into that draft, Pat, you know better than me because I didn't cover that draft because I'd already left the paper. But I mean, there was a chance that Drew Lock would have been a first-round pick in that draft, maybe towards the end of the first round, and he lasted to Denver in the second, then gets traded. I don't know what the separation was between Jones and Lock going into that draft, and Lock played pretty well in Seattle towards the end of the last year. I mean, he beat Philadelphia, I think, in a Monday night game.
Yeah, he did. Played great.
I would not be shocked, despite, I mean, what Schoen and Daboll are saying now is what they have to say, that Daniel Jones is our starter. But the guy's coming off an ACL, he's coming off his second neck injury. I know he came back from the neck injury last year, and then he hurt the ACL. But, I mean, I think there's got to be some concerns about his durability and availability. And if Lock becomes a revelation in the offseason and then Daniel's not ready for the start of training camp and he starts building the chemistry with the receivers and with Neighbors, who I think is going to be a great player. And I'm not saying the Giants made a mistake because I don't like Neighbors. I just think they were in position to take a quarterback in a really rich quarterback draft. And they passed on the guy who I think, with the asterisk because I'm prejudiced here, I think McCarthy is going to be the best quarterback when we look back on this in 2 years out of this group. And we're going to say, this guy's been the most productive. He wound up in the best spot. But getting back to the whole thing with Lock, I do think he has a chance to make inroads on Daniel's job. And the longer he's not able to participate, the better chance Lock has. Cousins, I just think, even if Penix is lights out over the summer, I just don't. I mean, Arthur Blank's going to go. go to the coach and go, we just gave this guy $90 million guaranteed, and we're telling me we're going to start a rookie?
Right.
Come on, that I don't think that could happen. But
so wait, did you go on the record there saying JJ would be the top quarterback in this class, or were you saying in the group of quarterbacks who are realistically available to the Giants?
No, in this class, I think he's going to be the best of the four guys that were talked about most. And I
wow,
not putting Penix or Nix in that group. Pat, again, I watched not on tape, but live, in real time.
Yeah.
I mean, I've watched every Michigan game for the last 10 years since my son was a freshman there. And even after he graduated 6 years ago, I developed this, really strong allegiance to them. And so I watched every snap that J.J. McCarthy played in college.
Mm.
And now, listen, I'm only making the comparison here because it's an analogy that I think is relevant. I'm not comparing the players. Okay?
I know where you're going. Let's go. Let's do it.
They said the only guy who could stop Michael Jordan was Dean Smith. Is this what you thought I was going to say?
No.
Okay. I want to hear what you thought I was going to say.
Oh, I thought you were going with a Tom Brady Michigan comp. That's where I thought
No,
you were going.
No. He's a better player in Michigan than Brady was. Although Brady was 20-5. People forget that.
Mm-hmm.
Coming out of college, and when Jordan had the incredible rookie year, and like the first month he was scoring 30 points a game, they said, well, yeah, the only guy who could stop him was Dean Smith, because Dean, that was just the way he played, his offense. I think we're going to look back on this and say the only person stopping McCarthy from being a prolific quarterback in college was Jim Harbaugh. He had the offensive line that in JJ's first year and then his freshman year, where he just played a little bit, that won that Joe Moore Award. So he had the best offensive line in the country, and he had a great offensive line last year, although they didn't win the award. Blake Corum was one of the best college running backs I've seen. And I think he's going to have a really good career. I've heard comparisons to Emmitt Smith. I don't quite buy that one, but I think he's going to be really good. And
Agreed.
Donovan Edwards was a really good change-up back. So Harbaugh wanted to win the championship, and he goes, we got a running game that nobody could stop. They had an NFL offensive line and two NFL running backs, because Edwards, I think, will be a high pick next year. And under different circumstances, he would have had McCarthy playing 35 times, throwing 35 times a game. I think it was to McCarthy's detriment that he played a different way, because all you heard coming out in the draft process was, Penix threw it 35 times a game, and Jaden Daniels did, and Drake. And so JJ didn't have the body of work.
Yeah.
But I saw when they needed him to throw that he was able to make, those tight window throws to Roman Wilson. He's really good hitting the tight end coming over the middle, throws a nice screen pass, doesn't throw it in the dirt. He needs to work on the sideline passes a little bit, but I think that's all footwork. Admittedly, I didn't see the other guys play anywhere near as much as I saw McCarthy play, but I thought he would have been a perfect quarterback for Daboll.
Do you agree with me that, and I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, saying that Daniel Jones is now their quarterback, but do you agree that if they had gotten a developmental high pick quarterback in the building, and obviously they were trying to do that with Drake May, they just couldn't make that trade up to 3, but that would have in some ways helped reset the clock a little bit, especially for Brian Daboll, where like if you're giving him that asset, you're giving him a little bit more time to show that he can develop him, hopefully the way that Josh Allen came along in Buffalo? Or do you still think that wouldn't have necessarily helped Daboll in a year like this, and that it's actually good for the coach ultimately that he got a weapon that helps his offense rather than a QB who might not have played?
You can really look at that either way you just set it up, that Neighbors no doubt is going to, regardless of who the quarterback is going to improve the Giants offense. I mean, the guy's a dynamic playmaker who can score from anywhere on the field. So that's going to improve their offense, regardless whether it's Jones or Locke or DeVito, if he gets a chance to play. But don't laugh. He's a Syracuse guy now.
You're ready for some more cutlets. That's what you're ready for.
No,
I can tell.
That might be taking it a little too far. But as far as if they had gotten May, or obviously they didn't want McCarthy because they passed on him, and May was the guy they wanted. That would have definitely bought him time because, depending on what would have happened this season, how quickly he would have got him on the field. And then if May played well and the arrow was pointing up at the end of the year, that means Daboll did a good job with him. So I think he'd get a chance to then, go forward with him. But, and Pat, I mean, you were really out front on this story about just the friction that have existed on the Giants coaching staff last year, and how many, I mean, I don't know the number, but how many new coaches he has here. And a lot of it was because some guys didn't want to work. I know with Wink, especially, didn't want to work for him anymore. I mean, if there continues to be that turmoil on the coaching staff, I think regardless of what happens on the field this year, Daboll will be gone, because you can't exist with the head coach yelling at his coaches and yelling at his players when he doesn't have the resume to back it up. It's one thing. Parcells got away with it because he was Bill Parcells and won a Super Bowl. He couldn't do that before he won the Super Bowl. And Belichick got to be Belichick because he won a Super Bowl in his second year in New England. You can't get away with that winning 6 games a year. And even though people forget about, the record his first year here. Now it's like last year was a year of turmoil and underachievement. And, this is a crucial year for Daboll. And, a year ago we're sitting here and saying, this guy was the coach of the year, and, what a great hire after Shermer and Judge. And now we're thinking, well, he's going to last. He's lasted longer than these guys, but how much longer? So this is a really important year for him. I do think if things calm down on his staff, and Jones or Locke play relatively well this year, that it will buy him some more time, especially if they get a big contribution from neighbors. But if Jones plays like he did last year before he got hurt, and Drew Lock just turns out to be a journeyman, I don't really know where they go from here, because it's not considered a strong quarterback draft next year.
Let's take that hypothetical further, because this is already something that's a primary topic about the Giants as a hypothetical, and it's going to be talked about all season until it gets put to rest. Gary, in your opinion, if this season goes off the rails again and Brian Daboll loses his job, is Bill Belichick going to be the head coach of the New York Giants in 2025?
It depends on one thing.
What's that?
Which job would he rather have, the Cowboy job or the Giant job?
Okay. I'm glad you said that, because the Cowboys as well as anybody as well. You've written a book on the Cowboys. You have a good relationship with Jerry Jones. Do you think Bill Belichick and Jerry Jones could work together? Do you think Jerry would welcome that type of a strong head coaching personality into that organization? Or do you think, even though we know Belichick is attracted by that job and there's a lot of talent on the roster, but ultimately, do you think that would not mesh?
I think that Belichick should have been the coach of the Cowboys, should be the coach of the Cowboys right now. I just can't believe that with him sitting there, and let's face it, Jerry's in his early 80s, and I hope he lives for another 35 years. But you get to that point, you got to start thinking, I got to win something. I got to win it. And the fact that he's running it back with Mike McCarthy, who is proven, he only got to one Super Bowl with Aaron Rodgers, one of the great quarterbacks of all time. And he's been in Dallas 4 years now, I think. Is that what it is? 3 or 4 years?
3 or 4.
Yeah, I forget. I'm surprised that he's giving him another opportunity when he had the chance to hire Belichick. Now, the point that's really important to make here is that Belichick and Parcells are probably closer right now than at any other point since they first hooked up in 1981. And despite what people might think, Parcells loved working for Jerry Jones. He did not leave there because of Jerry Jones. He left there because he made an emotional decision after Tony Romo dropped the snap on that field goal that would have beaten Seattle in the playoff game. And Bill just was drained emotionally and made a decision that he's told me he regrets. That he should have thought about it some more or just made the decision to come back. Jerry was begging him to come back. The point of this is because Belichick now consults with Parcells on a lot of things. If he says, will I get along with Jerry Jones? Can I work for this guy? And Parcells is going to tell him yes. Will McClay is one of the better personnel guys in the league.
He is.
Bill wants to just coach. He wants to pass Shula. He wants to win a Super Bowl without Tom Brady to kind of quiet the narrative because people are now saying, well, the fact that Brady won it without Belichick and Belichick did nothing without Brady, it just proves that 20 years together that it was all Belichick, which to me is a bunch of crap. I mean, there's no relevance to what they did separate when trying to evaluate what they did together. So I think that is a situation that could work. But I know that Belichick loves the Giants, loves them. And if given the opportunity to come here, I think that he would probably pick that over Dallas unless the Giants have one of these god-awful seasons that he looks at the team and says the personnel is 2 or 3 years away and I don't have 2 or 3 years and I want to win now. Then he goes to Dallas. It also depends on what his own evaluation would be of Joe Schoen, because I think Daboll is on the hot seat. I don't think that Joe Schoen is. And so whatever Belichick thinks of Schoen could factor into his evaluation. I do want to tell you this. So, I can tell this story now because I'm 4 years removed from it. I sat next to Belichick at a Hall of Fame meeting, and I probably told you this story in 2020. And I said to him, Bill, in January of 2018, I wrote, it was one of my last columns for the Daily News. I said, that whole Wickersham story had just come out on the turmoil in New England, and the Giants hadn't yet hired Pat Shurmur. I wrote a column. This was the time for the Giants to go out and get you. You love the Giants. It's the one job you would take. Now, that was 2 years after the facts. This is 2020. We were talking about 2018. And Bill said, and this is when Gettleman was still the general manager.
What he said?
Bill said to me that at this point in my life, I don't have the energy to go in someplace and completely start over by reworking the front office and having to bring in my own scouts, my own general manager to run the front office for me. I just want to coach. That's why when everybody was saying people were turned off by Belichick in this hiring process because they were afraid of him because he was going to want to run everything. Now, unless Bill was not telling the truth to Arthur Blank and whoever else he spoke to by saying, I just want to coach, and they felt when he came in, he was, all bets were off. He was going to want to take over. Then I can understand them being afraid of him. But he told me that in 2020 when he wasn't thinking of leaving. And he was talking about in 2018, he didn't want to do it. So he's not going to want to do it. He wouldn't want to do it this year or in 2025. So that's why I'm saying if he has a high regard for Joe Schoen, he's going to just want to come in here and coach, get those 15 victories to pass Shula and win and try to win a Super Bowl without Brady. It just depends where he thinks he's got the better shot.
That's a great story. That's him saying he doesn't want to do the personnel side and he just wants to coach before his worst and most discouraging seasons that kind of, beat him down and were difficult to run as far as a coaching side and the personnel side in New England. So after he tells you that, he goes through more that would only reinforce the fatigue of having your hand in everything, right? Here's one thing I've been thinking about as you've been telling this story, and you referenced Bill Parcells earlier. Joe Schoen calls Bill Parcells a mentor because they know each other from his days in Miami. And so thinking about it, if this season goes off the rails for the Giants, certainly, as you said, I agree, Brian Daboll is on the hot seat. there's a debate about, listen, if it goes poorly enough and the roster is a huge part of it, and it's not just easy to pin it on how the team is being coached, is Joe Schoen on the hot seat as well? It's interesting now with this Parcells connection and how close Bill Belichick is with Parcells, and also Schoen counting him as a mentor and leaning on Parcells. That could be a conduit and kind of a common ground where, especially if Bill is not interested in getting involved in that side of things, that could be something that actually saves, quote unquote, Joe Schoen, and could result in Bill Belichick coming in and the GM not getting blown out the door. Because I personally felt like if you're going to Belichick, maybe you're just blowing it all up. But as I sit here talking to you about this, I think, well, maybe Parcells would be the middle ground there. Who knows?
I mean, that's very possible, because there's really no way to overstate what I said a minute ago, that the two Bills are really best buddies again. They live near each other in Florida. Whenever Belichick would go down there, he would meet with Parcells like at 6:30 in the morning. I painted this scene in my book at this place called Bagel Bistro in Tequesta, Florida. They'd be sitting there 6:30 on a Saturday morning, just talking ball. And so I know that, yeah, there you go. I was trying to make a joke here about you got the name of your
cut you off there. Sorry.
No. You got the name of your podcast after them talking ball.
Yeah. Right.
So I think that that whole connection with Schoen and Parcells is interesting. If you remember, 2 days after the Patriots season ended this year, Belichick hadn't been fired yet, and he was fired. About what anybody wants to say, he was fired. He comes out and says, I'm perfectly fine giving up my personnel control here. I just want to coach. He was sending a message to the rest of the league that he didn't have to be the GM and coach. It couldn't have worked in New England because he had that job. And when you have that job, you can't all of a sudden then work for somebody else in a job that you had, right?
Right.
Case in point, Tom Coughlin ran the show in Jacksonville. He comes to the Giants with Ernie Corsi as general manager and then Jerry Reese. Mm-hmm. He couldn't have stayed in Jacksonville and worked for another general manager because he was the general manager. But he can come to the Giants because he was never the general manager here and just coach. That's how I look at Belichick's situation. He can go to any of the other 31 teams and just coach because he's never been the general manager there. So he's not giving up the power that he's already had. And that's a much easier transition than if he had stayed somehow and they worked out an agreement in New England that Elliott Wolf was the GM and Belichick was the coach. And Belichick would be going, wait a minute, Elliott Wolf, his father is my contemporary, not you. I'm not going to be listening to you. Right?
Right.
For the organization that I built for the last 20 years. But it's different if he comes and works for the Giants or goes to Dallas where McClay calls the shots. It's just a completely different situation. That's why I think both of them would work. And how cool a story would that be for you to cover if it's the Giants versus the Cowboys fighting over Parcells? I mean, that'll be tremendous.
I was just talking about this with somebody the other day where, obviously everybody on the outside sees Bill Belichick's press conferences and how he deals with the media on camera and that kind of thing. And their first reaction is, oh, wouldn't that be brutal? I said, brutal. The stories write themselves. The 100-year anniversary, the centennial anniversary of the franchise. Here comes the 2-time Super Bowl winning defensive coordinator / greatest head coach of all time. A guy who the Giants also defeated in the Super Bowls, Eli Manning, right? And the Giants taking him down with the pass rush and those great plays down the stretch. The franchise is intertwined with this guy's legacy. And then him coming to New York to then prove that, it wasn't just Brady. I can do it, and I'm going to do it with a landmark NFL franchise in the Big Apple. I mean, he could stonewall me in his press conferences all he wanted to, right? I'd still have a smile on my face.
Well, the thing is, the way what he showed on that McAfee draft broadcast, I didn't watch. I just saw clips on the internet, but that's who he really is. When not when he's not at his press conferences. Because that's how he was, and I hadn't spoken to him for a really long time before I sat next to him that day at the Hall of Fame. I hadn't talked to him for 15 years because I killed him in the Daily News over the Spygate stuff.
And he doesn't. He has a long memory, right?
Yeah. So he was not. I don't want to say he was disrespectful to me in press conferences, but anytime he answered one of my questions, there was not a lot of warmth there. But sitting next to him that day, I saw the other side that people told me existed. And Pat, if you remember watching the Football Life that NFL Films did on him, it was actually a two-parter, and they followed him around for the 2009 season. And one of the opening scenes in the first part was when the Patriots were playing the Giants in a preseason game, and it was the last year of Giants Stadium. So NFL Films brings Belichick over to Giants Stadium sometime in the afternoon because he goes into the Giants locker room, and nobody was there. And he kind of does a tour of the locker room. Or perhaps it was an early season game. I think it was a preseason game. It might have been an early season game against the Jets. I can't remember. But in any event, he's giving a tour of the locker room. This is where I played handball or racquetball with Dave Jennings. And, this is what we did. This was our coach's meeting room. And I can't believe how small it is now that I think about it. And then he stood up against the wall and he got teary-eyed talking about his time with Giants. I mean, he really got emotional. And when he was talking about the Giants for my book, now the stuff I used in my book, I mean, in complete transparency here, we did it on email. I would have preferred to do it in person with him. He preferred to do it on email. He said, my answers will be better on email. So I said, fine, if that's the way you want to do it. And when he was writing I asked him about that scene from the Football Life where he got emotional. He started answering it and put in parentheses, I'm getting emotional just typing this now. So I know how he feels about the Giants. And that's going to have a really strong tug at his heart if he has that opportunity. I don't think the fact that Brian Daboll is one of his former assistants will enter into, I can't go in there and take over for a guy that used to work for me. This is all about his legacy, passing Shula, winning a Super Bowl without Brady. Where does he have the best chance to do it? As we're sitting here today, and if you're evaluating the two rosters, you'd clearly say Dallas. But a year from now, who's the quarterback in Dallas?
Right.
We don't know, right? I mean, Dak Prescott could be the quarterback for the Cowboys for the Giants for all we know.
You're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead to one of my other questions.
Yeah, Kirk Cousins could be the quarterback for the Giants next year. Those things are hard to predict. And the other thing is when we look ahead to the quarterback draft next year, and people go, "Oh, it's a weak year." Tell me what you thought of Jaden Daniels a year ago at this time.
Right.
Probably. Right. I mean, you heard of him, but okay, he's going to be the second pick in the draft. What are you talking about? A year ago, nobody would have said that. So there's 2 or 3 guys out there that are going to emerge during the next college football season that nobody's even thinking about now.
One more Belichick question. So kind of a two-parter. Do you think if it tugged on the heartstrings for Belichick, a possible return to the Giants, do you think it would tug on the heartstrings for John Mara, especially given that, Bill and Wellington Mara had such a close relationship, John's father, and that all ties into it. And another part of, I guess, the Giants side of the decision is if Bill was only going to coach for 2-3 years to get the wins record, right? Because he's not getting any younger. Is it any different of a decision for the Giants if we are in that position? Obviously, this is the hypothetical where the season goes poorly and you're definitely hiring a new coach.
Okay, so I'll throw that back at you. Would you rather have Belichick for 2 or 3 years or do what the Giants have been doing, hiring Pat Shermer, Joe Judge, and Brian Daboll? Whoever the next guy is on that list.
Answers itself. Yeah. And I also think, and you and I worked on this together before when you were at the Daily News and kind of showing me the ropes, right. And on the NFL. And really the Giants have either been trying to, or have been hiring all of his proteges, right? They were trying to hire Josh McDaniels a couple different times, Matt Patricia at one point. They did hire Joe Judge. They did hire Brian Daboll, a former longtime New England Belichick assistant as well. So from my vantage point, it's like, wait, so Belichick comes available and you're going to hire all the guys who work for him, but not him?
Yeah, I mean, they hired Daboll because of the work he did in Buffalo.
Right.
But
Right.
having Belichick on his resume certainly, added to how attractive he was as a candidate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as far as relationship with John Mara, Parcells and Belichick's relationship was with Wellington. John really started working there full time in 1991, right before Parcells left. It was right exactly the time that Tisch bought his 50% in February of 91. Parcells left in May of 91. John was around during those years, but not on a full-time basis. He was working at a law firm. Same thing in the Belichick years. His contact with John wasn't what it was with Wellington. Now, John did consult with Belichick before he hired Joe Judge. I know that he spoke to him a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
And, he would see him in league meetings over the years. So they do have a relationship. But the attractive part of the job for Belichick would be like the Mara family and the Giants' history and how much he loved working here and how comfortable he was in his years here. I think there's less of an unknown than there would be in Dallas. But again, if that job becomes open, it's because the Cowboys underachieved again. And that could just mean losing in the divisional round again, even though they didn't even get that far this year. So the Cowboys could be built to win in 2025 if they don't win this year. And Belichick might say, well, as much as my heart and my emotions are saying, go back to the Giants and end my career there, he might say, well, the two major goals, and you don't necessarily include straightening out the Giants, it's passing Shula and winning a Super Bowl, and I got a better chance to do that in the short term in Dallas.
Right. Well, this has been the best Bill Belichick Giants insight I've heard in a long time. I hope all of our listeners and viewers and fans watching are taking all this in and rewinding and watching it again, because this really, through Gary's reporting and eyes and experience, I think gives you a really fascinating and full circle context on Belichick and all of the different connections of his web through the league and how that could play out in relation to the Giants, the Cowboys, the job market. And as you know, Gary, like I said, this is one of the top topics in the NFL, and it's going to be one of the top topics around the Giants, really from this point until Brian Daboll either solidifies himself or that hot seat burns a flame. A couple more questions on the Giants, and then I know you have your busy schedule and you need to get out of here, but I wanted to ask you, going back to the draft quickly, one question about the receiver they took, Malik Neighbors versus Rome Odunze, the Washington wideout. And I know you said you were at the national championship game, and I remembered you telling me that Odunze was open a lot in that game. It's just there was too much pressure on Penix. He couldn't get the ball to him. Did it surprise you at all that they took Neighbors, a very talented player who's only 20 years old with some, I don't want to call it character issues, but there were some red flags that teams were looking at. There was the gun arrest. People said at the combine, he was a bit of a malcontent. He actually didn't even weigh in at the combine, which is something that people I talk to, they say they don't even remember that happening before for like a top prospect, just refusing to even get weighed in, let alone do any of the drills. And Odunze seemed like a clean prospect, plus based on what a lot of people have said, including you, seemed like an elite talent. So wondering, what you think of their choice, and also really the choice in the context for the Giants of kind of taking the guy with the talent and the character flags versus the guy who looked more clean.
Yeah, I think Odunze is going to be just a great player. He's a physical receiver who gets separation and has great hands. I mean, now he was playing with a quarterback who, could really throw it. So I thought that I didn't see enough of Neighbors play. I just saw the highlights, but he's probably a little more explosive with the ball in his hands. He really reminds me of Beckham. And maybe I mean, you had the exposure to him in the press conference, Pat. You tell me, did he remind you of Beckham in terms of his attitude? Just
No,
being a guy that can be a me guy in the locker room. Do you get that feeling from him at all?
he seemed a little bit more flippant than Odell. Like Odell always struck me as thoughtful, but obviously things could always tend to be focused at some point back on himself, right? But Odell always struck me as a guy who was thoughtful. Neighbors struck me as, well, he was tired, first of all. But I think really what came across to me is, seems like a kid who was very emotional and in a good way about being selected and drafted and was very grateful for that. But he came off like a 20-year-old, and I know
Okay.
there were immaturity issues with Beckham too, but I definitely felt like he was more, how do I put it? He's a little bit more reckless with his words, like as far as like he did a podcast with the Pivot, those guys, Ryan Clark and Fred Taylor and Channing Crowder. And he said like his attitude on the field is he wants to F guys over because he knows they're trying to do the same thing to him. So it was a little bit, maybe even if you can believe it, even more overconfident than Odell Beckham Jr. was, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
I think the Giants, although this current administration wasn't here for Odell, I think they probably went to school on any mistakes they made with Odell. John will, especially, I didn't realize he was only 20. I think John will fill them in, and people who are still in the organization will fill in Daboll and Shane on, we just got to help this guy grow up a little bit because here are the issues that we had with Odell. And the reason you make the comparison, obviously, because they, both went to LSU and they're similar type players to me.
Yeah, no, for
That's,
sure.
that's what I was wondering. Odunze, I think he's supposed to be a great character kid. As a player, he reminds me of T.O. I'm not saying T.O. off the field. I mean, T.O. was a knucklehead. This guy was running the cone drill, until he got the time right that he wanted at the combine after everybody had left the stadium. I mean, that tells you something about him. And I haven't heard one bad word about him. And I think he's more of a sure thing because I think he's a little more mature. But I think all three receivers in this draft are going to be, Pro Bowl type players for sure. And it's just a question of, who wound up in the best situation in terms of, the quarterback getting him the ball. Because a lot of this is, determined by your surroundings. That's why I think McCarthy's going to, once he gets on the field, I think he's had a great year in Minnesota because look what he's got around him.
No doubt.
Jefferson and Addison, and when Hawkinson comes back and Aaron Jones is a really good running back who can catch it, and they have a good offensive line there. I mean, it's set up for success. Minnesota was the best situation for any of these rookie quarterbacks. But I had no quarrel with the Giants taking Neighbors because to me, it's almost like a flip of the coin. They're different players, but I think they're both going to be great.
Okay, so two more, and then we'll get you out of here. One is, and you started hitting at it earlier in the interview, but let's just play it out and say, hypothetically, Daniel Jones is not able to lock the quarterback job down. Obviously, like you said, if he gets healthy, balls out, they get back to the playoffs, he plays well, he's their quarterback, right? They have him signed to that 4-year, $160 million contract extension. If he does not, and the Giants need to plan for another quarterback come 2025, let me give you some options, and I want you to tell me, maybe your top two most palatable options just off the cuff. So you have the draft, of course, which no one likes to plan for having a top 3 pick, but you have a guy like Shedeur Sanders, Quinn Ewers, possibly Carson Beck, names like that. But then in free agency, these are potential quarterbacks who could be available. Dak Prescott, Tua Tagovailoa, Geno Smith, Kyler Murray, Derek Carr, Trevor Lawrence, Jared Goff. Do any of those names jump out to you as, now, of course, do I expect Jared Goff not to be re-signed? I mean, based on how Detroit acts, yeah, I feel like he's going to still be there. But Do any of those names jump out to you as like the obvious, most preferable option to the Giants if they have to go that route?
Well, let's look at it like this. If Trevor Lawrence is available, that means that where would he be in terms of getting a fifth-year option picked up? He's going into his fourth year, so they would have. Did they have to pick up the fifth-year option? No, not quite yet. Right, next week
Or
the end of this week.
Yeah, we're right at that time where teams are starting to pick all of those up.
Yeah. So if they don't pick up that option on him, then that tells you something.
I
And to me,
believe they might have, because
Okay.
he's under contract for 2025. So I think they picked that up.
Okay, so then he won't be available next year if he's already under contract, right?
Right.
The
Right.
fifth-year options for 2025.
Right.
Correct. Dak, it doesn't appear that the Cowboys are going to sign him to an extension, although it would really help out their cap. Maybe things change now that the draft is over. I would say that if you could, if the combination is Belichick and Dak, I would take my chances with that.
Oh, wow. By the way, Lawrence's fifth-year option was picked up yesterday, so that's why I had not crossed him off my list, which I should have done.
Okay.
That's my mistake.
Okay. Now, Jared Goff, I mean, I think the indications are that the Lions do want to get a long-term deal done with him, and he's played really well for them, so I would anticipate that happening. Who else do you have on your list there, Pat?
I had Tua, Geno, Kyler Murray, Derek Carr. So those were the other names.
Forget about Derek Carr. I don't want Geno. I know he's your pal. No, I have no interest in that.
To be honest, I don't really think he would. He'd be eager to play in New York again anyway. You know what I mean?
Tua, again, if he's not signed to a long-term deal by the Dolphins, that tells me something. And there was one other guy.
Did we say Kyler Murray?
Kyler Murray. His deal is up after this year?
I think they could possibly get out of his contract, I think is how it works.
Yeah. So I look at a bunch of these guys here that you've mentioned, that the only reason they become free is because their current teams don't want them anymore when they're in position to lock them up. And, maybe they're ready to move on. I don't know. But all those guys, I would think, will get extensions. I mean, I don't really think that, or the fact that the Dolphins haven't locked up Tua yet, maybe, I don't know. I just think that, again, these young guys who don't get the second contract with the team that drafted them, I think that sets up a red flag.
Agree. All right.
If Daniel Jones can get a second contract, how does Tua not get a second contract?
Last question. I know you follow the whole NFL, all of New York football. Just wondering what you think of Joe Douglas and the Jets and how they did in the draft, especially taking Olu Fashanu, the tackle, in the first round when they could have easily gone with Brock Bowers, the tight end, or a wide receiver.
Where they picked Olu, I have no problem with them going with a tackle. I thought that's the direction they needed to go. They signed two 33-year-old tackles, one coming off surgery, and then Smith hasn't played a full season since 2015. So I have no problem with that. However, and that's sitting where they were. And I got no problem with them passing over Brock Bowers. The issue I have, I know they loved Odunze. And apparently, starting around the Giants pick, up through the Bears were picking 9, they tried to move up to get Odunze. And I'm really surprised they couldn't get a trade done, especially with Atlanta. But Atlanta was so locked in on Penix, they were probably afraid if they flipped 8 and 10 with the Jets, that the Bears then, who wanted Odunze, might have traded out to the Raiders, who could have taken Penix at 9. So clearly the Falcons didn't want to take any chance on losing Michael Penix, which I think would have been the best thing for them to lose Michael Penix. But, I didn't think that Odunze would necessarily come that close to the Jets. And the fact that they couldn't, even like Tennessee, right? I mean, they wanted Joe Alt, and they missed out on him. I would think that they would have, instead of taking Latham, that's who they took at 7, right? It was Latham from Alabama.
J.C. Latham, yep.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that would have been a great spot to trade down because there was a cluster of offensive tackles after Joe Alt, but they could have got any one of them, perhaps, and the Jets could have moved up to 7 to get Odunze, which I think would have been a good move, and then they could have taken a tackle maybe in the 3rd round.
And it was fascinating to me that, to put a bow on it, that like I've dug around and found out that the Colts had tried to trade all the way up to the Giants pick at 6 from 15. And I've talked to 2 people in the league who think that they were coming up for Brock Bowers, the Georgia tight end. I don't know what the terms of the deal were in the end, but I know that Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll had a chance to move out and get more assets in a deeper draft next year. And of course, we know what the lay of the land is, the fact that they need to show some progress this year, but kind of telling and reinforcing that they took an elite player. But of course, you don't want to necessarily trade out of the elite players in a draft either. So,
yeah, I think the real answer will come, Pat. We'll see what Neighbors does. If he turns out to be a 1,300-yard receiver in his rookie year and scores 7 or 8 touchdowns, then trading back to 15 or whatever wouldn't have been worth it. You know, if he gets hurt, I mean, you can't really blame him if he gets hurt. But if he's just not productive or becomes unhappy here because he's not getting the ball, you know, maybe trading down. But I don't like trading from an elite position in number 6 down to 15, unless you're going to get 3 number 1s.
Yeah, so you're taking the call, but you're not seriously considering it unless it's a Godfather offer, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I could have seen flipping with Tennessee or something like that if they wanted. If there was another tackle they really wanted, they were afraid the Giants would. There could have been a deal in there that the Giants wouldn't have had to move down too far, but the fact that they couldn't, I think getting one of these top players in this draft was probably the best thing. Although I would have taken McCarthy.
Yeah, right. JJ, this has been a great conversation and episode. I was going to title it, Gary Myers and I are talking NFL draft, recapping the Giants, something along those lines, JJ McCarthy. I think this became the Bill Belichick episode when all was said and done, and I think is really a good table setter for that element of the Giants and the NFL offseason. So thank you so much for your insight. His book is Once a Giant, a story of victory, tragedy, and life after football. Gary, anything else you want to add about the book or any upcoming events, signings, et cetera, that you want the fans to be aware of?
Yeah, Pat, and I know you stopped by for this last September when I had Phil Simms as my guest at Bookends in Ridgewood, New Jersey, and it was just an incredibly successful and popular event. We sold over 600 books that night, which is unheard of. But
wow, I'm
going back to Bookends because people have asked me, are you doing anything for Father's Day? So May 16th at Bookends at 6:00 in Ridgewood, I have Harry Carson and Leonard Marshall, 2 of the most important players from the Super Bowl 21 team, foundation of that tremendous defense. They're going to be there signing books with me in Ridgewood, 6:00 on May 16th. Did I say the 18th? It's the 16th. May 16th. Yeah. So, Pat, I hope you can stop by if your schedule permits.
I'll be there.
And I'll take you out to dinner afterwards.
Wow. Now I'll definitely be there. I was kind of half-hearted the first time, but now you said you're going to pick up the tab. I'll be there. Now, Gary, thank you so much. It is a fantastic book, not just for Giants fans either. Giants fans will love it 100%, but NFL fans too. A lot of NFL history, a lot of great behind-the-scenes stories about some big-time names and players and games that the headlines of, but you don't know the details about. Once a Giant, a story of victory, tragedy, and life after football. Here on the Talkin Ball with Pat Leonard podcast, we are sponsored, remember, by Bet Online, also by Estate 98 Coffee and Essentia Day Cafe from El Salvador, dates back to 1798. He is the one and only Gary Myers. Gary, thanks for stopping by as always.
Take care, Pat. Thanks a lot.